Thank you. Could I ask those members who are leaving the chamber to please do so quickly and quietly, as we will now move to the final item of business this evening. And the final item of business is a members' business debate on motion 20178 in the name of Tim Eagle on supporting Scotland's bridges. This debate will be concluded without any questions being put. I would invite those members who would wish to speak in the debate to please press the request to speak button. And I call on Tim Eagle to open the debate. Up to 7 minutes, please. Could we have Mr Eagle's microphone? Thank you.
Can I start that again, Presiding Officer? Thank you, Presiding Officer, and thank you to all of those that will be speaking in this debate today. Some might be wondering why, a few months out from a critical election, I am here talking about bridges. The truth is, Presiding Officer, that each trip we do, whether walking on a bike, in a car, a bus or a train, we will probably go over a bridge. Often many, sometimes without knowing. Whilst many gaze at the wonder of the Forth bridges as you come into Edinburgh, few probably take a moment to recognise the many road bridges which just connect us with our communities every day. Because in truth, this is a debate about connectivity. This is a debate about how we keep communities together and how we ensure that just because critical infrastructure is getting old, because it is costly to fix, this Parliament and this government don't use that as a reason to ignore it. So whilst it might not dominate the evening news, it is absolutely vital to the daily lives of people in rural and, for that matter, urban Scotland. On the 14th of December last year, residents of Murray, like myself, woke up to what we thought was a joke. AI photos of a deeply popular 19th century iron bridge connecting Spey Bay and Garmouth, the Spey Viaduct, torn in two and lying twisted in the river. What seemed unlikely very quickly became reality. It was no joke. A popular bridge was no more. It formed part of the historic Murray Coast Railway and later became an important part of the National Cycle Network next to the Speyside Way. The day before, I can guarantee that many people, including young children on bikes, would have been crossing it. I am so thankful that when it did collapse, no one was on the bridge at the time. Early engineering inspections suggest scour and soil erosion around its foundations. A slow process that undermines even our most enduring bridges was likely a cause. Some want to play the blame game. I want it fixed. This iconic structure is now closed with no immediate solution to reopen it, pending specialist inspections and, crucially, funding for either repair or replacement. I commend the communities of Garmouth and Spey Bay, and in particular the Speyside Coffee Roasting Company and the Scottish Dolphin Centre, for their strong support to see the bridge repaired. Meanwhile, Clodagh Bridge, built in 1905, has stood for over a century as part of the River Lossy, crossing near Burney and Elgin. It was closed to motor vehicles in February 2022 after inspections showed its condition had deteriorated to the point where it could no longer safely carry heavy traffic. Weight restrictions had been progressively tightened over the years before closure. It remains open only to pedestrians and cyclists, but without significant investment to replace or repair it, the bridge risks being lost entirely and its communities it serves left divided. Absolutely.
Douglas Ross.
I'm very grateful to Tim Eagle for giving way. I was delighted when I secured a significant investment from the UK Government to go towards the cost of reopening Clodagh Bridge. That was then agreed by Murray Council only after Heldon Community Council put forward a significant amount of money for further studies into the work needed. Now that the Labour Government have shamefully withdrawn that funding, does the member agree with me that at the very least they should be doing is paying back Heldon Community Council, because those funds would be far better spent in the local area rather than being wasted on a project that can't go ahead now because of the UK Labour Government's decision?
Tim Eagle.
I completely agree with that point. The community, Douglas Ross, I commend him actually. Douglas Ross put a huge amount of work into trying to secure that money from the UK Government at the time. It is a real shame that the Labour Government didn't continue to agree to that, because Murray Council had planned. And as Douglas has just laid out, the community actually raised a significant volume of money to see that happen. And I do think the Labour Government, I know there's no front benches here, but I do think the Labour Government need to reflect on that. For me, both these bridges are local, both are historic, but they share a much deeper commonality. They show how vital these physical links are are to the people who use them every day, and how fragile our rural connectivity has become under the strain of age, underinvestment and funding pressures. And this isn't just a Murray problem. Across rural Scotland, bridges large and small are ageing and falling into disrepair. They are on councils' ambers and red lists of concern, yet the works required to restore them are often not being done at the pace or scale needed. Councils are doing their best with constrained budgets, but local government funding simply does not stretch to cover the scale of maintenance and renewal needed for this critical infrastructure. We have seen similar situations elsewhere too. In Aberdeenshire, constituents in Aboyne have been campaigning for repairs to their bridge, which has been closed and is now only now seeing strengthening work agreed. And I'm sure my colleague Alexander Burnett will highlight that later. In Keith, another area in Murray, a landslip at Union Bridge took over a year to repair, and that was on the main A96, a critical road for the north of Scotland. That's an unacceptable timetable. Further south, in Dumfries and Galloway, in Finlay Carson's ward, Kirkcudbright Bridge has faced closure and structural restrictions due to deterioration, requiring traffic management measures and long-term replacement plans. I'm pretty confident I could name a bridge in every ward in Scotland that's future is uncertain. Even onto the same rivers we have problems, with Highland Council putting several bridges into managed decline, including the Spey Bridge at Cromdale, a critical link between the village and Granton-on-Spey. Whatever the Scottish Government want to tell me tonight about funding and support is not a reality on the ground. If it was, Clodagh, Aboyne, Spey, Kirkcudbright Bridge would have been fixed much sooner, and perhaps there would be a clearer future already for Spey Viaduct. I'd rather not hear about what the SNP think they have done, but instead how they will ensure proactive, strategic support targeted at rural connections that go beyond headline infrastructure projects. That means we need more support for rural bridge maintenance and renewal. It means practical support for councils to plan long-term programmes rather than firefight crises. It means ensuring that listed historic bridges get the specialist attention they deserve, and it means consistent monitoring with specialist inspections before problems become catastrophic collapses. Sure,
Richard Lockhead.
Can I thank the member for giving way and emphasising the importance of regular inspections? You may be aware, of course, that following representations from tenacious members of the Garmouth community for the last few years, I was pressing the Murray Council to carry out a full structural survey of the Spey Viaduct, which didn't happen. And therefore, going forward, these regular surveys do have to happen by local authorities. And in terms of the options going forward for the Spey Viaduct, we have to have that expedited in a sense of urgency to try and make and rebuild trust with the local community in Murray.
Tim Eagle.
I do agree with the point, and that's why I put it in my speech, that actually regular surveys are required. The problem is that Murray Council's funding has been so depleted over the years that they haven't always been able to do that. But what I don't want to do is get into an argument about the blame game, because Garmouth community, and I know they've made representations to Richard Lockhead as well, are distinctly telling me that that is not what they want. What they want ultimately is that bridge fixed, and I spent an hour and a half with the Dolphin Centre on Monday talking about exactly that. We owe it to the people of Murray, to communities from the Highlands to the borders, and to every rural village and hamlet that relies on these connections. Our bridges do not just cross rivers and valleys, they connect people, futures and livelihoods. So I think like many things we discuss in this chamber, it is an election issue. It is something our communities are looking for us to help with, so let us in this Parliament act decisively to protect Scotland's rural bridges and recognise their vital place in our nation's infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Eagle. I now move to the open debate. Backbench speeches of up to 4 minutes. I call Emma Roddick to be followed by Finlay Carson. Ms Roddick.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Firstly, I congratulate Tim Eagle, MSP, on securing time for this debate and thank him for his attention on this issue. I hope that he and colleagues across the chamber will agree that I'm quite keen in general on building bridges. I've genuinely always had a real soft spot for them, so much so that when I was in primary 7 and kids in my class were told we could do a project on anything we wanted, I chose bridges. I drew the Keswick Bridge, the Golden Gate Bridge and a little wooden bridge that crosses a burn near my house in Alness. I wrote about the complex maths that goes into their design, the different uses and how the Keswick Bridge connected my home of Alness and Rossher to the big city of Inverness. While the overall improvements to journeys are welcome, the fact that my train home from here no longer goes over the Forth Rail Bridge is a matter of deep regret to me, because I'd always paused to admire the engineering and the scale of those incredible structures. Scotland should be more proud of our bridges and our story, from Thomas Telford to the Queensferry Crossing. And we should be taking better care of the ones that currently join up our communities but are too often taken for granted. My family and some teachers were genuinely disappointed when I diverted to politics instead of engineering, and I joked when I first got elected here that I might spend a term arguing for some bridges and tunnels and then go and help build them. Because Scotland can do better if we are better connected. Our island communities, parts of cities separated by rivers or wide roads, and out-of-town unis or workplaces that were built without care for how folk were going to get there, can all see boosts in their opportunities and potential with some bridges. Thomas Telford and the governments who commissioned his work understood that bridges, while on the face of it being about transport and connectivity, could also be strong drivers for tackling poverty and depopulation. Many of the bridges that have prompted today's debate or been mentioned in the motion and take part in various other conversations across the country were built in his era in areas that are still facing those challenges. Tim Eagle and I represent some of the communities most affected by depopulation, and we're both listing crucial bridges that are falling apart in those areas. Depopulation challenges will get worse if we do not protect what we have, as well as building what we don't. Talk of managed decline is deeply concerning to me, because I'm not just picturing a bridge crumbling and declining. I know that we're talking about managed decline of beloved walks, of commutes to work, of heavily photographed tourist hotspots, and sadly whole communities. I want to see more bridges, so my heart breaks a bit when I see coverage of regular infirmary bridge closures in Inverness over the years, or this week the very concerning closure of the Jubilee Bridge in Nairn due to a sinkhole. Yesterday we were debating positive destinations and routes to work. That bridge in Nairn is a literal path to education for small children. It's a safer route to school for many in Nairn. It's a cherished walk, it's a busy crossing that is used and relied upon every single day. We know that crisis management is more expensive and more disruptive to people than proactive maintenance. And this is a national issue, which is about attitude as much as it's about finances. But I do think we need to see a change in both and agree that our bridges are worth protecting. So I look forward to hearing from the Cabinet Secretary, and I hope that the Scottish Government shares some of the passion for bridges that we're hearing so far in this debate. If we can build something as beautiful, complex and record-breaking as the Queensferry Crossing, we can look after Telford's bridges, and we can even build more to connect the Highlands and Islands. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Roddick. I now call Finlay Carson to be followed by David Russell. Mr Carson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Firstly, can I congratulate my friend and colleague for bringing this important issue to the Chamber. Bridges in rural Scotland are far more than physical structures. They are lifeline connecting families to healthcare, pupils to their schools, local businesses to their customers and emergency services to people who rely on them. When one of these crossings fails, the consequences are immediate, far-reaching and often severe. Tim Eagle has spoken about the Spey Viaduct, demonstrating in the clearest possible terms that even historic structures we assume to be permanent are increasingly vulnerable. The Spey Viaduct is not an isolated case. Across Scotland, councils are being forced into impossible choices. Highland Council has already acknowledged that some bridges will now be entering managed decline. UK-wide, the RAC Foundation continues to identify thousands of council-managed bridges rated as substandard or restricted, weight-limited or awaiting essential repairs that local authorities simply can't afford in the near term. Presiding Officer, this is the national context into which the people of Kirkcudbright were thrust last year. I'm speaking about the A755 Kirkcudbright Bridge, not the other famous Telford Bridge at Tungland. But the Kirkcudbright Bridge is a key crossing that the town relies on every single day. In 2021, in March the 21st, 2025, Dumfries and Galloway Council took the difficult decision, but the necessary decision to close the bridge to all vehicle traffic. Engineers had confirmed it no longer met the minimum loading requirements. Pedestrians and cyclists could still cross, but the vital road link, the practical everyday connection, was severed and a 5-mile detour put in place. By July, following further assessment with engineers, the bridge reopened, but under severe restrictions. These measures, while inconvenient, are a solution to avoid total closure. They are a clear engineering judgment that the structure is at the end of its working life. Automatic number plate recognition and CCTV enforcement had to be deployed because non-compliance posed a real risk. And I hear that far too many people are still breaking the rules and are not being prosecuted. Throughout this period, the community and businesses of Kirkcudbright showed remarkable patience and resilience. They adapted to the diversions, delays and uncertainty. They lived with very real questions about what would happen if the bridge's condition deteriorated further, particularly regarding emergency access. To its credit, the Council recognised the scale of the challenge. It's designated a replacement for the A755 Kirkcudbright Bridge as a strategic priority. An initial budget allocation was approved last April, and approximately £100,000 is now being used to develop the outlined business case. But a full replacement bridge is a multi-year, multi-stage undertaking. It requires design, progression, statutory processes, environmental and land surveys, procurement and, crucially, construction. Construction funding that no single authority can or should be expected to shoulder alone. But there's been much debate about Scottish Government intervention and project-specific funding. Indeed, I called on the First Minister for support when the bridge first closed. And I'm not going to repeat these arguments. But the central point is, if a bridge is essential to local and regional connectivity, as Kirkcudbright unquestionably is, then Scotland needs a practical co-funding mechanism that allows these projects to move quickly and keep towns connected. I can't overstate the impact on the local economy, with businesses from cafes and hotels to trades and tourists. Presiding Officer, Kirkcudbright is far from the only example, and it's not just reserved to road bridges. And we'll hear later on with a contribution from Craig Hoy about footbridges in Annan. But it underlines once more that rural Scotland is being asked to absorb infrastructure losses it can't afford to shoulder. So today I'm calling for future governments to consider the creation of a multi-year ring-fenced national bridge programme, jointly funded with local authorities. Priorities should be transparent and based on lifeline criteria, such as healthcare access, education, emergency response, freight and tourism. We need accelerated replacement for structures where capacity is already structurally exhausted, as in Kirkcudbright. That means early funding stage design, surveys and statutory work, so communities aren't left waiting for years before construction can begin. As safeguarding exercises, we need strengthened weight limit compliance. Automatic number plate recognition enforcement has proven somewhat effective in Kirkcudbright, but more needs to be done. Rolling out similar systems nationwide will help protect vulnerable bridges and extend their lifespan. Our weather patterns are changing, and we need increased investment in climate-resistant resilience, particularly score monitoring and riverbed surveys to reduce the risk of sudden failure. Finally, Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government needs to recognise that councils are facing bridge backlogs measured in tens and hundreds of millions, and we need long-term practical funding, not short-term pots that disappear before projects can advance. This motion is about safeguarding connectivity, the rural economy and public confidence. Bridges hold communities together. When they fail, communities fail. Kirkcudbright Bridge serves as a warning, but they are also an opportunity to modernise Scotland's local infrastructure and to protect rural communities that rely on these crossings every day.
Thank you, Mr Carson. Could I take this opportunity to remind members that it's backbench speeches of up to 4 minutes, as members have agreed to by their participation in this debate. I call Davy Russell, to be followed by Alexander Burnett. Mr Russell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd like to thank Tim Eagle for bringing this debate to Parliament. Just as roads and rail, once upon a time canals as well, were the vital arteries of our nation that have for hundreds of years driven prosperity in this country, we all take for granted the actual key to this brilliant network functioning, and it's bridges. Whether it's a viaduct on a canal route or a wee narrow bridge on a country road connecting two villages, or the mighty Forth Rail Bridge, oozing magnificence, strutting Scotland's past engineering expertise for over 135 years. However, with the exception of the many great structures, we have ignored this vital piece of Scottish infrastructure. Most bridges go unnoticed until there's a failure. It's usually caused by lack of good inspection and maintenance regimes, which has been a common theme over the last 20 years. At the same time, maintenance and inspection budgets for structures have been reducing, which is a great pity, because we have thousands of these tremendous structures. They're actually works of art in some cases, which we are putting into danger, especially the old ornate type that are prevalent throughout rural Scotland. General maintenance can take months. However, a new bridge can take several years, causing rather than tens of thousands, it can cost tens of millions. Being a keen fisher, I have came across many bridges over the years, and it's the first thing you look for when it starts to rain and you get a bit of shelter. However, you usually have your peace and a cup of tea while you're under the bridge, but then you start to notice the finite detail and precision. It actually makes you wonder how they were actually constructed in the first place, considering most were built before we were all born, technology and equipment were primitive, and that might be the civil engineer in me. In closing, I could go very hard on the SNP and say that they seem to be doing is all they seem to be doing is managing decline rather than rolling their sleeves up and tackling the issues that affect these structures. But I must recognise that we've built a few bridges at the same time. The Squinty Bridge in Glasgow, the Queensferry Road Bridge, and the eyesore that many of you have seen in the M8, the Rusty Bridge that all the kids call it anyway. It's a bit of a monstrosity, and very few will actually put their name to that one, but it's there nonetheless. But bridges are a vital part of our heritage and essential to the economy, regardless of how magnificent or ugly they are. But, mentioned earlier, most go unnoticed, just performing the function they were actually designed to do. So here today, a more cross-party cooperation in protecting these valuable assets is what's needed. That, as a sustainable funding model, should allow communities to benefit from existing infrastructure, obviously solutions that economists and people of Scotland will actually choose. That is, we should actually look after and cherish what we already have, because it's only when it isn't there that they actually miss it.
Thank you, Mr Russell. I call Alexander Burnett, who's joining us remotely, to be followed by Stephen Kerr. Mr Burnett.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and thank you to Tim Eagle for bringing this critical issue to debate. Now, bridge infrastructure has been an issue in my constituency, Aberdeenshire West, since I was first elected a decade ago. Park Bridge closed in 2019, and 7 years later, despite community wishes, there are no plans to reopen it, as the council simply do not have the funds. And now the communities of Dramoke and Durris are separated by a 16-mile round trip. Back then, I pointed out that if Aberdeenshire Council had to spend £5 million a year to maintain its 1,800 bridges, but was only able to afford half of that, then you didn't need to be a bridge engineer to foresee the consequences. And back then, there were only 55 bridges on the critical list. Roll on to 2023, and a Boyne Bridge was closed to traffic, forcing a 20-mile round trip over neighbouring Dinnet Bridge, which itself is now on red alert. Now, early proposals suggested a 2027 reopening, but just before Christmas, investigations revealed the damage was worse than previously thought. And now the bridge may be closed to pedestrians and cyclists as well. Repairs could cost up to £15 million and a replacement £30 million. But residents know the council simply do not have the funds available to make these necessary repairs. And it's worth highlighting that this is just for one bridge. There are now over 100 bridges in Aberdeenshire on the critical list, either closed or at risk of closure in the next 4 years. Emergency vehicles experiencing longer journey times, businesses suffering through reduced footfall or increased costs, and communities suffering from their links to other communities being broken. But the root cause of this problem is the Scottish Government's chronic underfunding of Aberdeenshire Council. So after meeting with the community on the bridge at Aboyne on Monday, I wrote to the First Minister, because enough is enough. This is not an ask, this is now a demand for John Swinney to come to Aboyne to rectify an intolerable situation which has literally divided the community. So I hope John Swinney will accept my invitation to visit the Fix Aboyne Bridge Community Action Group and explain why the Scottish Government has so far refused to provide the support for reopening this essential bridge. And I'd urge the Cabinet Secretary tonight to listen to the cases being raised today and commit to ensuring councils have the necessary funding to stop our rural communities from being divided. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Burnett. I now call Stephen Kerr to be followed by Craig Hoy. Mr Kerr.
Presiding Officer, pleased to speak in this debate and pleased to appreciate the efforts of my colleague Tim Eagle in bringing this motion to Parliament. Because listening to my colleagues speak and across the chamber, it's absolutely clear how much we depend on bridges. Bridges are not abstractions. They're the difference, as Alexander Burnett has just said, between getting to work or not, or between an ambulance taking a direct route or a long diversion or a local business coping or closing its doors. I mean, I remember when we had the replacement work done on the bridge on Kersh Road in Stirling that connected the city centre with the Springkirk Industrial Estate. I mean, that was closed for nearly a year, and it caused real chaos, not just to the traffic, but to the access to Stirling and also to those businesses on the Springkirk Industrial Estate. So I just want to mention across central Scotland, and indeed broader Stirlingshire, that we see the value of these structures and the consequences of leaving maintenance too long. Many of the bridges were built for a different age. The one that I've referenced on the Kersh Road was over 100 years old when it was eventually replaced by Network Rail. And they've served us well, but they're under increasing strain. There's heavier traffic. I mean, EVs alone weigh a tonne. Harsher weather and years of constrained investment, which has been highlighted especially by Alexander Burnett and Finn Carson. In Falkirk, the Jinkabout Bridge near the golf club in Grangemouth shows what happens when decisions are delayed. Years of severe weight restrictions affected local movement and economic activity. Only full replacement restored capacity. It was the right decision, but it required capital funding that's increasingly difficult, if not nigh impossible, for councils to secure. In Stirlingshire, the Cardross Bridge between Arnprior and the Lake of Menteith is a good example. It's a historic crossing, a vital local route. The council invested more than £1 million to keep it in use, but even after that work, it will not reopen with permanent reopen with a permanent weight limit. And that tells its own story, that we're often no longer talking about improving capacity, but preventing loss. And there are similar pressures in other such structures, such as Blaine Water, the crossing between Killearn and Croft-Tammy, where intervention was essential simply to keep the route open. What concerns me most, and this has been talked about by my colleagues, is this description of managed decline. David Russell hit on that note as well. That's not a neutral technical term. It's a policy choice. It's an act of selective neglect driven by funding constraint that accepts the gradual loss of vital infrastructure. And communities feel that loss through longer journeys, reduced resilience, declining confidence in the network they rely on every day. And this is not about blaming councils. They're making hard choices with limited resources. There are significant shortages too of bridge engineers, and councils are finding it harder and harder to secure the specialist skills needed to keep structures safe and operational. If we continue to neglect maintenance, we will continue to pay more later through emergency closures, rushed repairs and avoidable disruption. Bridges are lifelines. In central Scotland, as elsewhere, they underpin economic activity, connectivity, public safety. And recognising the problem as necessary is not enough. It's not sufficient. What's needed now, and Finn Carson said it very eloquently, what's needed now is for a future government to ring-fence funds for a bridge fund in order to provide the sustained, realistic investment, because there needs to be a clear national commitment to stop vital infrastructure being allowed to fail by default and neglect.
Thank you, Mr Kerr. I call Craig Hoy to be followed by Edward Mountain. Mr Hoy.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And I would like to thank Tim Eagle for securing this debate today. And across Scotland, there are many bridges which are in need of urgent investment, and we've heard of a number of those today. And one of the most pressing in the areas that I represent relates to the Tale of Two Bridges project in Annan in Dumfriesshire. In a storm in October 2021, ferocious currents and rising floodwater swept away the Diamond Jubilee and Cuthbertson Memorial bridges. SEPA recorded water levels on the River Annan to be at a 50-year high. And these iconic, well-used crossings to the west and north of the Royal Borough of Annan were loved locally but were lost to the elements. The Diamond Jubilee Bridge was built in 1897 to mark the 60th anniversary of Queen Victoria's accession to the throne, and the Cuthbertson Memorial Bridge dated back to 1957 to commemorate Lieutenant William Cuthbertson, but that was also dedicated to everyone from Annan who lost their lives in World War II. These were not just local landmarks which showcased the beauty of the River Annan, but they were also used by walkers on the popular Annandale Way route. The community, after they were swept away, quite rightly came to the view that everything that could be done and should be done to replace them should take place. And in 2023, the charity The Tale of Two Bridges was formed with a mission of using citizenship and community development to reconstruct these vital bridges. And I've recently been in discussion with Stuart Thompson, a dedicated local volunteer who has been spearheading these efforts. And I would like to commend him and the charity for their efforts to raise the funds to scope out the replacement plan and to bring forward a feasibility study, which I understand is now potentially in place. Stuart and the team are liaising with Dumfries and Galloway Council and other public bodies, and they need cross-party support from elected representatives to drive the project forward. Because, as always, funding and other technical and legal matters are impeding progress. For example, who would take responsibility for the physical assets if and when the bridges are reconstructed in an era where councils and other public bodies are reluctant to add to their asset portfolio due to rising maintenance costs. And in recent weeks, the Scottish Government and the SNP Council locally have committed nearly £70 million to an expensive, unpopular and potentially ineffective flood defence scheme on White Sands on the River Nith in Dumfries. Now, some of this money and some of the political capital invested in that scheme could have been put into making or reconstructing Annan's two bridges, to make that a reality. But sadly, so far, the money is proving elusive, as is the political will at a Scottish Government level. Now, John Swinney visited Annan after the bridges were washed away, and while he described the loss of the bridges as a significant blow to the community, little progress has been made, Minister, at a government level. And I do echo the calls from colleagues for a specific bridge fund, because around Scotland there are many such cases. Now, 5 years on, the community now appears to be at a loss as to how to proceed. Now, there is a potential solution, Minister, one which my colleague David Mundell last week raised at Westminster. He has urged the Secretary of State for Scotland to utilise unallocated funds within the Borderlands Growth Deal to progress the project, and Mr Mundell has met with Scotland Office Ministers this week to drive that forward. Because, as David Mundell said, the important thing is getting the money out of the door. And as several projects initially identified for Borderlands funding are now not proceeding, replacing the bridges at Annan could be a practical and sensible use of those Borderland funds. So can I close with this appeal to the Scottish Government? These bridges are a loss to the people of Annan and to the heritage of Dumfriesshire and the South of Scotland region. And I hope, therefore, that the Scottish Government and the UK Government can now work together at pace to identify the money necessary to restore these vital landmarks, not just for the people of Annan, but for the wider region. And can I encourage both governments to engage with the Tale of Two Bridges group to make this a reality? These bridges are a lifeline for many.
Thank you, Mr Hoy. And I call Edward Mountain.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I had no intention of speaking in this debate. I wanted to listen to it, but I have been prompted to come to my feet to talk on a couple of issues. First of all, I'd like to remind a member of my register of interest that I own a fishery on the River Spey jointly with my brother. What I've learnt, Presiding Officer, of over 50 years, well, I think 40 years where I could say that I've had some knowledge of rivers, is that I've learned that rivers are alive and dynamic. They change on a regular basis. And what I've also learned is that in the last few years, climate change makes them more so. They move and they shift within the boundaries that we perhaps expected them to stay in the past, and they don't stay within that. We've seen increased flows and we've seen more movement of sediment and gravel. And that makes the maintenance of bridges far more important. It's not the maintenance of bridges when they fall down, but it's the maintenance of bridges before they fall down. Because those of you that walk along riverbanks and look under bridges will see that bridges build up levels of gravel underneath them. And the Spey Viaduct, may I suggest, was one of them, where it had moved from the original course of the river and moved out to one of the abutments and beyond. Now, the problem is that really, if we're going to do maintenance to the bridges, it's not just to the structure, it's to the riverbank as well. And the problem then becomes is that we have to get into the river and dig. That is the only way to do it, Presiding Officer. Now, there is something that prohibits people doing that, and that is called the Controlled Activity Regulations, which frightens people away. They are complex regulations which require costs and a massive amount of consideration, especially where, in the case of the Spey, it's an SAC and a SSSI. It literally frightens people away from doing the work that they need to do round bridges. And what I would say, if I may, Presiding Officer, to the Cabinet Secretary, is while she ponders over the issue of money for the maintenance of bridges, I would also ask her to ponder about sending a signal out to those people that manage bridges to say that if you want to take preventative action before they fall down by going into the river and digging it out and making the river flow where it should be flowed and where it's channelled by those bridges, that the government and SEPA will do everything in their powers to make it happen. Thank you, President Officer.
Thank you, Mr Mountain. I now call on Cabinet Secretary Fiona Hislop to respond to the debate. Around 7 minutes, please.
Presiding Officer, I'd like to thank the members for an informed and passionate contribution. The Scottish Government recognises the value and importance of bridges to Scottish society. They provide more than just physical links. They deliver significant social value by contributing to prosperity, improving mobility, and our national infrastructure extends across Scotland, with trunk road bridges across rural areas, island and estuaries being part of that national connectivity, making them fundamental to economic development and community wellbeing, as many members, including Emma Roddick, had pointed out. And the safety of our bridges is obviously key. I am very aware of the challenges involved in managing ageing bridge stock. As Scottish ministers are responsible for over 1,700 bridges, many of which are over 120 years old. For example, the General Wade Bridge on the A83 at Inverary, 1776, and the A84 Teeth Bridge from 1535. And it follows then that an ageing asset implies the need for constant maintenance, as David Russell pointed out. And it's imperative that the properly qualified inspectors carry out inspections on a regular basis, and that inspection data is the backbone for asset investment decisions. Now, that is the approach adopted by the Scottish Government. Inspections are carried out in accordance with the national standards. General inspections are carried out every 2 years, and principal inspections are carried out every 6 years, with monitoring, reactive and special inspections as required. Now, one of the biggest risks to bridges is scour, a risk that has been exacerbated in recent years by the effects of climate change, and I'm pleased that Edward Mountain, in his contribution, raised that point. I would highlight Storm Babette in 2023 and how scour affected many of our trunk road structures, for example, the A90 at Finavon. And such events require an emergency response to maintain public safety and resources to be diverted away from planned activities. Ultimately, responsibility for the inspection, maintenance and investment decisions for local bridges rests entirely with Scotland's local authorities. Now, these structures are owned and managed by Council, and it is for them to determine priorities, allocate resources and lead on the development of repair or replacement plans in line with local needs and asset conditions. I think, Craig Coy, will you want to...
Craig Coy?
Thank the Minister for giving way. Does she share the concerns of many local authorities, for example Aberdeenshire, that the capital projections coming forward in the budget last week are grim for Scottish councils, with a net £1 billion reduction feeding through? And isn't that going to seriously hamper the routine maintenance that falls on councils, which means that the condition of bridges is probably going to get worse, Minister, rather than better as a result of the lack of capital investment by this government?
So I do want to address some capital issues that the member might be interested in. We have, as the Scottish Government, provided record levels of funding to local government. Aberdeenshire had a 7.2% increase last year, Dumfries and Galloway 6.4%, Murray Council 6.6%. The 2026-27 Scottish Budget sets out multi-year spending plans covering 3 years of resource funding and 4 years of capital funding to provide greater certainty for councils, and that will help certainly with the planning aspects that members have asked for. Now, local authorities have autonomy to allocate funding to bridge and road maintenance, primarily through their general capital allocations, and they take their own decisions on investment priorities, reflecting local needs, risk and asset condition. In 2026-27, the local government settlement allocated capital grants totalling £681.4 million. Now, I want to highlight the specific example, as it's been raised of the Spey Viaduct, which was affected by Scour in December 2025. It is, of course, owned by Murray Council. There is also a Boyne Bridge owned by Aberdeenshire Council, which has been subject to restrictions since 2023. Now, ultimately, it is for the councils to lead on the next steps. They will need time to work through the options, including consulting and engaging with local communities, as they always do. But for our part, the Government is more than happy to be part of those discussions. But, Presiding Officer, we remain acutely aware of the financial pressures across the public sector, with high inflation driven by global factors, alongside reduced capital grant allocations from the UK Government, I want to make progress, which continue to impact the affordability and timing of infrastructure investment across Scotland. And I would remind members that in 2020 to 2022, the SNP Government did operate a local bridge maintenance fund of £32 million. But of course, since then, we had the period of capital grant cuts to the Scottish Government, including, of course, the infamous Liz Truss quasi-quashing budget. So there are implications of capital cuts in that regard. So although the Scottish Government is not responsible for local bridges, there have been occasions when we have been able to, in specific circumstances, offer support for the wider community or for strategic reasons. When I served as Cabinet Secretary for Tourism, I was pleased to secure funding through the Rural Tourism Infrastructure Plan for the new Lossiemouth footbridge. Now, that investment restored vital access to the town's wonderful beach and helped strengthen Lossiemouth's position as an important and welcoming tourist destination. Now, to further elaborate on the Spey Viaduct example, it is clear that the Spey Viaduct played a greater role to those in Murray than just a river crossing. It had cultural and historical significance and facilitated journeys and recreational activities for locals and visitors alike. Now, Scottish Government officials are continuing to engage with Murray Council, High Trans and Walk Wheel Cycle Trust to assist in minimising disruption and find a solution. And local constituency MSP Richard Lockhead has sought and secured a meeting with me and briefed me on the very recent community meeting. Now, in the days following the incident, the priority lay in making the area safe and investigating the cause of the collapse. The focus now has shifted to reopening the National Cycle Network route, the Murray Coastal Path and linkage points with the Speyside Way, using an alternative crossing of the river and safe paths through the Gordon Castle area. The new route having been confirmed and fresh signage to be put in place. Now, for a long-term solution, including consideration of repair or replacement, Murray Council have developed a plan with 4 key assessment steps, which will provide clarity on the impact the collapse has had on the riverbed and land surrounding the site. Now, significant funding is required to take us through these steps, and Murray Council are exploring the options available. I am pleased to confirm that the Scottish Government will provide £113,000 from the Active Travel Infrastructure Fund, which will allow additional engineering assessments, planning activities and alternative route implementation works to be completed now and the end of the 2025-26 financial year, and I hope the Conservatives will be supporting the active travel budget in that regard. Presiding Officer, let me conclude by re-emphasising the Government's commitment to our bridge network. Working with local partners, we will continue to ensure its maintenance, its utility to the public and its potential to open up all kinds of associated activity to the benefit of Scotland and its economy. But in doing so, members must not just call for improved capital funding for local councils, but perhaps in the spirit expressed by Davy Russell, they must also call for improved capital funding and indeed increased borrowing powers to allow longer-term planning across councils and this government for this government and this Parliament. Thank you.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. That concludes the debate and I close this meeting.